I'm joined today by Professor Peter Coleman. He's professor of psychology and education at Columbia University, also director of the International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, and author of The 5%, Finding Solutions to Seemingly Impossible Conflicts. Let's start, Professor, maybe with that title. Who are the 5% that you describe?
The 5% comes from some research that looks at really international conflicts over about a 200-year period. And what researchers have found is that if you look at all of the conflicts that have taken place really between states and nations in that time, a very small percentage of them, about 5% of them, get stuck into kind of an ongoing, very polarized, destructive dynamic that sometimes lasts 40, 50, 60 years or more. And they are unresponsive to typical attempts to resolve them, diplomacy, mediation, negotiations. There's some evidence that those types of strategies actually make them worse. So it's those 5% of conflicts that we study in the international domain, but we also see evidence of these types of dynamics that take place in domestic relations and political dynamics here, in the pro-life, pro-choice, conflict in some communities, et cetera. So,
okay, so that gives us a sense. So I guess you kind of started to answer what was going to be my follow-up, which is speaking domestically, you talked about pro-choice, pro-life. What other issues would kind of fall within these seemingly intractable conflicts domestically?
well, I mean, they can happen in families. Oftentimes, there is a dispute between siblings, between parents and children that become protracted, and really people feel constrained by and really see no way out. There are instances in New York City where I live where you'll have a couple that will need to divorce, but stay in the same apartment because they can't afford another dwelling. So they get stuck into this kind of negative dynamic, and they're trapped because they can't physically leave. So those are the basic conditions, and they happen again in families, they happen in communities, they happen in universities, they happen at our university where you'll see an ongoing dispute. Columbia University, where I teach, has had an ongoing dispute organized around the Israeli-Palestinian tensions, but on campus where Israeli students or Jewish students feel discriminated against by certain professors, and so those types of dynamics can play out domestically as well as internationally.
Thinking about so-called kind of partisanship in the context of American politics since the Civil War,
Yep.
have there been changes in the amount of so-called bipartisanship, or the two sides, the Democrats and Republicans working together over time, or has it been roughly the same?
Yeah, no, there has been considerable changes. Again, there's data on this over several generations, a couple of centuries, going back to before the U.S. Civil War. And the data looks at really whether Republicans and Democrats will cross the aisle and support a bipartisan bill, or support a bill proposed by the other side. And what we found is that politics today in the United States, in terms of voting behaviors of Republicans and Democrats, are more polarized than they have been since the U.S. Civil War. So we've become increasingly more polarized in our inability to have the politicians sort of come together on consensus on solutions to issues. And that the current trajectory, the current trend towards more polarization started around 1980. That's when we really started to see more and more polarization. But yes, today the voting patterns are more polarized than really ever before in history, certainly back as far as the Civil War.
One could make any number of analyses about why that might be, and I want to throw a couple of ideas at you and see if you think either or neither or both have some validity. Some
Sure.
people email me and they say the reason why we don't get anywhere is politically between Democrats and Republicans is because there are only Democrats and Republicans. There is this two-party duopoly status quo, and that the injection of some viable third party would shake up this it's either one or the other kind of alternatives and force politicians to work together or to create more alliances. There's another side altogether, which emails me and says it's not so much about a third party, but it's kind of like a game theory discussion where there's almost no advantage to elected officials to be bipartisan because they've got their next election to think of. They raise money in great part because of these partisan issues that you talked about. Are either of these kind of evaluate either or both of those ideas?
Yeah, I think they're both valid issues. There's an incentive structure that keeps politicians focused more on short-term gains and being reelected, or moving into ideological beliefs and seeing compromise as the enemy. There are, in fact, many good arguments for why we are as stuck as we are. What we believe is that it's really some combination of all of those things that creates basically a set of constraints on politicians that really trap them and force them to sort of behave in a certain way that's consistent with the structure of the system. So what does that mean? That means that even though politics in this country the polarization of politics could be traced back to things like gerrymandering, to money in politics, the impact of lobbying, to religious beliefs, or to more fanaticism, to sort of the extremes, both parties driving the parties. All of those things are valid arguments. But what we believe is that somehow these things have sort of come together and support each other in complex ways. And so that even when one of these strategies, one of these issues, one of these drivers of the polarization drops away or is addressed or somehow is effectively remedied, it doesn't seem to have an impact on the patterns. The patterns still stay stuck. And that's because they're multiply determined. There are many reasons why they're stuck in this way. And a lot of the typical solutions that people try to introduce don't seem to have much impact. I know that at the State of the Union, not this year, but a couple of years back, the congressmen decided to sit not across the aisle from each other for the State of the Union, but sit next to each other. And
right.
There was a lot of ridicule regarding that strategy. But what that reflects is the fact that there is this change in the culture of Washington, where it used to be that politicians would move their families to D.C. and their families would go to school together and their kids would hang out together and they would have other kinds of contact other than the sort of disputes that they would face daily. And that allowed them, that created a different kind of dynamic between them that was more reasonable and more conciliatory. And that's changed. And so this attempt to sit next to each other during the State of the Union was some attempt to begin to reconstruct how these political actors interface. But let me just say one other thing, if I can, because it's easy to see the divisions in D.C. because we can count votes, we can see the political rhetoric coming particularly from the extremes of both sides. But this is reflective of our country, of where we are in our personal lives, most of us, in the media that we watch, in the opinions that we hold, in the parties that we go to, and the really more exclusionary nature of our social dynamics. This is really a bottom-up process, and the population of this country really need to take as much responsibility, I believe, as our leadership.
Very quickly, one other thing I want to just kind of throw in is when you talk about the bottom-up approach, do people have a desire to find simple explanations for political issues? And one example I'm drawn to is the language around tax relief is something that has been very effective for the American right, in the sense that, hey, if lower taxes are relief, that's very simple. More taxes are bad, less taxes are good, when the reality is a very nuanced shades of gray argument that is neither more, is not neither a ton nor is it no taxes, but people seem driven to simple explanations.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think under difficult circumstances, difficult economic times, under threatening times such as post 9/11, people are anxious and they do want to have a sense of sort of simple solutions provided by their leaders, provided by governments, and they latch on to those. And so, political operatives understand this. They understand that if you frame something that resonates with people's fears, concerns, basic needs, that they'll latch on to it and they'll support it, even if it's only half correct. But there are other organizations in this country that sort of try to counteract that. I mean, the media, to some degree, will try to provide more of a balanced perspective on these issues. But there are also dialogue forums, such as the National Issues Forum, which I would recommend your viewers go to. They have a website, and they try to present the nuance of a lot of these more complicated issues, the sort of gray area, and say that we're not trapped by the polarized dynamic. That there are solutions, there are strategies that are more informed by the complexity of these problems.
We've been speaking with Professor Peter Coleman, Professor of Psychology and Education at Columbia University. Check out The 5%, Finding Solutions to Seemingly Impossible Conflicts. Really a pleasure having you on. Thank you.
David, thank you very much.